The question was, how does something sustain itself over a very long period of time? Conspiracies do not hold together. A conspirator dies, one of the conspirators sells their story to a newspaper, that sort of thing. It's like a cartel. They're notorious for not holding together well. Um, but this thing has got robustness and longevity like nothing anyone has seen. And so, what we in part open that book by explaining how the politics of it work through explaining the simple math of campaign finance and how, if you're sort of an extremist, sort of elitist a group of people who truly believe that they're not subject to the rule of law and have the right to sort of operate above and beyond the rule of law, how by focusing your attention on screening candidates and putting candidates into office and then grooming them to rise in seniority in the Congress, you can, over a period of years, and it's been, since 1948, it's been only a few decades, you can now exert quite extraordinary influence inside the U.S. government. I don't know if control is quite the word, but it's very close to that at this point. And so it's very disturbing because it's a set of values that are very contrary to the values that we think we are governed by. And to even brush up against this at all and identify the common source, the great smokescreen is that and we predicted this in the book, is you'll be charged as, and this came from Noam Chomsky, whose analysis I think is 180 degrees off the mark, but he said it doesn't matter what the facts are. These are the original commissars. And I didn't realize he meant that literally, the original commissars. And it is literally the original commissars. He says the facts are irrelevant. You will be described as an anti-Semite, a Holocaust denier, and a Jew hater.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's so unfortunate because many of the greatest victims of this are the broader Jewish population whose identity as Jews has been manipulated by this very small group, many of whom just happen to have that same ethnicity, but are not, do not adhere to anything to do with the Jewish values or Judaism at all. They're largely agnostic or atheist.
Yeah, well, the play on victimhood here is very important. Maybe we can return to that question a little bit later. But again, I guess I return to the motive of expansion of Israel and the idea that they want to try to, obviously weaken the other states around Israel in the Middle East, etc. Because this, what you write about in the book, is a lot about how they managed to drag America into this war with the aid of the neocons and everything else that on faulty evidence really tried to pin something like 9/11 on Iraq, which was completely wrong, of course, but they managed to pull it off nonetheless, right?
Well, yeah, in order to do that, and you needed to dominate what a former defense secretary named Robert Gates, I think, aptly named he called them the people in between, which is a very generic, non-ethnic sort of term. And he said, when you're waging unconventional warfare, and it's only unconventional to those on whom the war is being waged, and that war is being waged against the American public, is one of their great victims in this. What you do is you put your operatives in that in-between space. If you have a democracy, or what little remains of it, and you want to have a system of governance based on facts and the rule of law, then it's essential that you have access to the facts in order to have informed consent, in order to know who to vote for, what to embrace, that sort of thing. And so what this group did, this syndicate, is they focused an enormous amount of attention on dominating media, which is a huge in-between domain. If you turn on CNN and you get Wolf Blitzer, 17 years with the Jerusalem Post, when he's talking about anything other than the Middle East, you get pretty straight news. If you go anywhere near that, you're not getting straight news. I'm sorry, you're just not. And you see that now with the ongoing, with what's happened in the post sort of Paris environment. But if you focus on advancing a narrative through dominance in media, in pop culture, in politics, in think tanks, in education, those 5 key domains, then you can induce people to embrace a narrative that they themselves can't really see that they're embracing, because it's the screen, the sort of frame through which they now perceive their world. So you noticed how we segued seamlessly from a Cold War fighting of people who hate our values into a war on terrorism fighting against people who hate our values.
Yeah.
And yet the values that are being undermined are the very values on which the country was founded, and they're in serious jeopardy right now.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Tell us more about those 5 domains again. Let's repeat those again and see what areas that people are manipulated within.
Well, media being the most obvious. Here, Canada, of course, was the Izzy Asper clan and the Black Conrad Black and that crowd. Here, it's the media dominance. All you need to do is turn on the news channels and look at the leadership within media. And if you go to pop culture, it's helpful, and particularly in film. If you want me to embrace a narrative, it helps if you can sort of pre-stage that narrative through numerous storylines that attract me into look at a screen and go, oh, that's very interesting, and then suddenly that storyline becomes a reality, and that's I mean, a quick story on that point. The fellow who's head of CBS and the fellow who's head of MCA, when CBS opened its office in New York, it began to feature what we called the top 40 songs, and he featured only MCA people that MCA had on retainer to do the performances. And so you were led to believe that that those songs were indeed the top 40. And you know what happened? If you believed they were the top 40, you went out and bought those songs. And then what happened? In fact,
They
became
became
the
the
top
top
40.
40. Exactly. Yep.
So a lot of this has to do with how you displace facts with what you can be induced to believe. And if you believe hard enough in something like the top 40, it becomes the top 40. If you believe that Israel is an ally, despite the facts, then they remain an ally. So part of this challenge has been to permeate that get in that in between domain and say, look, here are the true facts. In politics, if you just go down the list of those who've now come to power and the key agenda setting committees, you'll get an idea of what has been done. And that's not to say that these people are consciously complicit. It's that they themselves believe that they're doing the Lord's work, so to speak, by advancing an agenda that's consistent with the far right in Israel, that's inconsistent with our values, but we've been led to believe something very different. So you've got media, you've got pop culture, you've got politics, you've got think tanks, and this is a real nest bed of those complicit. Clearly, there's a number of NGOs that have operated abroad, many of them going after regime change. The National Republican Institute, chaired by the International Republican Institute, chaired by John McCain, the National Democratic Institute, chaired by Madeleine Albright, the Open Society, of course, funded and run by George Soros. And if you go down the list of those that have been most worrisome to those whose governments have been upset by this, you found that common sort of pro-Israeli staffing throughout all of them. But here in the U.S., having worked in politics and as a counsel to a committee in the Senate for many years, many of the ideas that come into politics come from those think tanks. And so if you can begin to dominate that area, then that's very helpful. In education, I was educated in what's called the Chicago model. And anyone who's taken anything to do with economics, business, law, finance, accounting in the last 80 years has been educated in what's called the Chicago model. And that is now, it's also called the neoliberal model. It's now been embedded in law. It's been embedded in contract law, corporate law, property law. And I found it best expressed in working as counsel to an investment banking firm in New York, when our partner would come in, our managing partner, and say in the morning, like a mantra, he'd say, money is smarter than people. Have we made any today? And that's the best summary I've yet to hear of a very, intricate, complex sort of theory called the Chicago model, now called the Washington consensus. And the notion is that money is smarter than people. The financial freedom has now become a proxy for personal freedom. And so instead of let my people go, it's now let my money go. Money's smarter than you. Do you have a Nobel Prize in economics? Well, no. Well, look at who all those Nobel Prizes in economics have been given to. Just go back and read them. I did. And you don't qualify unless you are an adherent and an advocate of this particular model. So you embed that mindset, and any value that cannot be identified and captured in terms of money is by law now, and I help write some of those laws, is by law displaced. And so the values like civil cohesion and fiscal foresight and environmental sustainability, if you were to ask people in communities what are the top values that they most want to see, those would be very near the top. But those values are displaced, and people have been induced to displace them freely. By the time you embed this sort of fiction, in enough mindsets, then suddenly you've got this shared mindset that becomes a consensus, and then you embed that consensus in politics and media and education and whatnot, and suddenly worldwide you've got the emergence of what we've now got, the greatest disparity in wealth and income we've had in history, oligarchs emerging everywhere we look, including the United States. And now, instead of the freedom of expression that now has the most power in politics, is the freedom to make campaign contributions.
Right.
So now you have Shelley Adelson, a ultra right wing, pro-Israeli American, pro-Likud supporter, very disappointed that the money he put into Mitt Romney's campaign did not get him into the White House so we could go to war with Iran. But he's likely to be back. He's quite likely to be back, he and his friends, with no limit on the amount of money that they can put into buying a presidency and taking us to war in Iran. To take us to war in Iran, it required the killing of 3,000 Americans, or people at least around the World Trade Center. We don't need that this time. Now the playing field is set so that, in effect, the presidency can be purchased.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Several points that I wanted to ask you more about. Has there been any difference under Obama?
Well, you'll see in the book the description of what's called assets. Assets are people, to some extent, we're all assets based on our beliefs and our needs and interests and appetites and whatnot. But assets are people that have been profiled in sufficient depth, that personality profile, that if you've put them in a time, place, and circumstance over which you can have an enormous amount of control, particularly in politics, then you know within an acceptable range of probabilities they will perform consistent with their profile. When you walked Monica Lewinsky in front of Bill Clinton, you knew within an acceptable range of profile of probabilities what the response was going to be. Okay? Now Barack Obama came to Chicago, spent 11 years at the University of Chicago teaching constitutional law. He was groomed first identified and groomed by Betty Lou Saltzman, who's the daughter of Phil Klutchnik, who was a UN ambassador back in the 70s, hugely pro-Israeli. I think initially he was an asset. I think my hope and every indication is that he woke up. He's obviously very smart, and he has a very stable situation around him, which helps. Clinton did not have that. LBJ, Kennedy, others did not have that with his wife and his children and whatnot. I think he woke up, and I think he realized that those who created his political career were attempting to use him. Now, I hope I'm not whistling past the graveyard on this, but we've clear indications, or at least what we hope were clear indications, that he is now waking up. Now, it's difficult to expose those who've done something like this when you yourself, if you yourself indeed are a product of those who've done this. That's very challenging. And because this is very nonlinear, how do you induce those who've done this to expose themselves? And if that is what is now going on, then I'm going to go, hooray, let's hope that's the case. I'm frankly thrilled that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to come to Washington and try to sell us on the war in Iran, and helped in that by John Boehner and others in the leadership in the Congress. My hope is that the American public is going to wake up and say, oh, we get it. We get it. Yeah. We're being sold another war, and who is doing the selling, and how did they come to office, and who supported their candidacies over the years, who helped put them in powers of position and powers and in certain places of position and influence where we can now be sold on yet another war that is not in our interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this may be very good news.